For an historian of the Middle East, the Albert Kahn collection holds some of the most startling images. They've caught a moment that is now utterly lost. And so to view these films, or to look at these colored photographs with all their startling clarity, is almost to climb into a time machine that takes you back to a Middle East that we could only imagine.
But the fact that some of them are in color make them very modern pictures, which is quite amazing because so much has happened since they were taken.
It shows me where I belong, where I come from, where my family comes from, and the tremendous changes have taken place in the way of life from those days to these days.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the French millionaire Albert Kahn launched a unique photographic project. He wanted to record the everyday life of cultures from around the world before they could be eradicated by the forces of modernity. After the First World War, Kahn's photographers made numerous visits to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul. From here, the Sultan had ruled over the Middle East for more than 4 centuries. But after years of decline and the Turks' ill-judged decision to side with Germany, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The victorious Allies decided the fate of the empire's former territories.
British and the French thought of the whole world, and of this area in particular, as a big cake, and they divided it and decided who gets a piece of what.
The map of the Middle East was redrawn to create a new region made up of modern nation-states. This would change the destinies of countries where for hundreds of years, Muslims, Christians and Jews had lived side by side under Ottoman rule. Albert Kahn wanted to make a record of the Middle East at this turning point in its history. In 1919, Kahn gave Lucien Le Saint, a veteran war cameraman, a new assignment when he sent him to Lebanon. After the defeat of the Turks, the British forces occupying Lebanon and Syria transferred control to France. Le Saint's camera captured the triumphant British withdrawal.
These are marvelous pictures of British and Indian troops marching over the mountains from inland Syria and down towards the coast. These troops could almost have been troops in the Napoleonic Wars. It's really fascinating to see them marching along with their pack mules and their camels, or some soldiers driving 2 or 3 sheep in front of them, no doubt to provide the dinners for that contingent the next week. There you see Indian troops, which of course played a huge role in the British Army, that inexhaustible supply of Indian manpower on which the British depended in 2 world wars.
Over 2.5 million British and Imperial soldiers fought in this region. They'd been joined by Arab forces that were rising up against the Ottomans. This so-called Arab revolt had been promoted by the British officer T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia. In return for their allegiance, the Arabs were promised independence in a self-governing united Arab state. One of their leaders was this man, Amir Faisal. In the Syrian capital Damascus, he waited for the British to honor their promise. But in a secret wartime accord, the British had also agreed to hand over control of Syria and Lebanon to the French.
The French were much more interested in Syria and Lebanon, where they'd had contacts, friendly contacts with the Maronites, the so-called Catholics of that region, since the Crusades. The French felt that they were the protectors of the Christian communities in the East, and they had large financial and commercial interests there.
By 1919, France was poised to take control of an area inhabited by both Muslims and the Christian Maronites. The French were sympathetic to the demands of their fellow Christians, who wanted to establish a separate country known as Le Grand Liban, Greater Lebanon. Beirut and the whole of Lebanon had suffered desperately during the war. A Turkish embargo cut off food supplies and brought mass starvation. The British mounted a massive relief effort. By the time Le Saint arrived, life was returning to normal.
Looking at these pictures give us an incredible insight into what life was like at that time.
One of the things that I really enjoyed the most about watching this film footage was the scenes of daily life in Beirut. People going about their shopping, transporting goods, playing, amusing themselves. You just get a look at life in the city. It's completely natural. We have the sense that there's nothing posed about it.
There's a wonderful picture of street entertainers, a tame monkey and some children attempting a belly dance.
The people of Beirut turned out in force to welcome their new governor. General Henri Gouraud was a French war hero. He'd lost his right arm fighting the Turks at Gallipoli. Le Saint was sent to film Gouraud's inauguration as the first French High Commissioner of Lebanon.
The power of that moment is beautifully captured in the photograph, which shows the quayside. I mean, there you see in vivid color the red, white, and blue of the French tricolor. And you really get a sense of the massing of the people. You could practically hear them calling out, "Vive Gouraud."
All the pomp and the ceremony and the uniforms and the horses and the parades, there really was a desire on the part of the French to show that they'd arrived and that they were important.
Of course, the Levant postings in those days were very highly prized, indeed for the whole mandate, because of the warm weather, the easy life, and the officers spent their time playing tennis with local girls or sitting around in cafes. And the troops, too, had a very good time.
With his cameras, Le Saint rode through the back streets of Beirut, observing the activities of French soldiers when they were off duty.
One scene in particular that stands out is with the prostitutes in front of a brothel, where we see mainly soldiers essentially flirting with a number of these prostitutes and behaving in quite a lewd manner.
You can see the brothel keeper sitting at the door, a rather older, plump lady. And of course, everybody jostling to have their photograph taken with one of the girls.
part of Beirut life, which is not the image that we have today of the Middle East and of Middle Eastern women. The prostitutes themselves are quite keen to perform, as it were. They're quite keen to be filmed and seem quite excited about this opportunity to be in front of a camera.
While his men enjoyed life in their new Middle Eastern playground, General Gouraud had more pressing matters on his mind. He needed to reassure the country's Maronites that their interests would be defended. Many Maronites were convinced they were entitled to special treatment. Having supported the Christian Knights during the Crusades, they believed they shared long-standing cultural values with the French.
As you see in the images here, the delegation of Maronites that call on Gouraud could be taken for Frenchmen themselves. They are French educated, they are French dressed. You can see them in their double-breasted suits and their ties. They're waving a flag which looks a variation on the tricolore. When they meet Gouraud, though you can't hear it here, they will speak a French that will be as perfect as if it were spoken on the boulevard of Paris.
The Christian Maronites lobbied for the creation of a state that they would dominate. They wanted territory more than 3 times the size of their traditional homeland, centered on Mount Lebanon. If granted, this would bring large numbers of Muslims, almost half of the country, under Christian Maronite rule. The Maronites got their way. In 1920, General Gouraud proclaimed the new state Greater Lebanon. But for the people of the region, Gouraud's decision came at a heavy price.
The separation of Lebanon and Syria was violent. Cities that had always enjoyed trade relations and whose people had moved freely back and forth now found themselves in 2 different countries, which broke long-standing economic ties, family ties, and a notion of a broader community.
To many Arabs, the transfer of power to the French was a betrayal. They'd fought alongside the British in their battles against the Ottomans. Now it seemed the British were reneging on their promise to support the cause of Arab independence. And in creating Greater Lebanon from peoples of diverse religious and ethnic backgrounds, the European powers had set in motion conflict that would continue to the present day. While France governed Lebanon and Syria, Britain took control of Iraq, Transjordan, and Palestine. Kahn sent his photographers on 3 separate missions to Jerusalem in the years following the Great War. In December 1917, the capture of Palestine by British troops had been one of the great military triumphs of World War I. For the first time in over 500 years, the Holy Land was under Christian rule. By the time the British arrived, Jerusalem was battered and war-weary. More than 1/3 of the population had either fled or died.
The British soldiers, when they came into Jerusalem, they didn't find the golden city of God. They really found a very, very desperate village which had gone through years of starvation and with no services at all, no water, no medical services, no food. So this was a city where hunger and starvation resided, not God.
I remember my father told me that the hardest years were the years of the war. They were very poor. They went years of great hunger, great poverty, to such a point that a simple commodity such as table salt was too expensive to buy. When we look at the pictures and we see the dust, they don't glamorize it, they don't romanticize it.
At the end of Ottoman rule, Palestine was home to 750,000 Arabs. Some were Bedouins who lived off the land. Traditionally, the lives of Bedouin people revolved around their villages and their families. For centuries, they'd lived peacefully alongside the country's Muslims and Jews.
When my grandmother, for example, married my grandfather, she married when she was 13. It was the Jewish neighbor who showed her how to cook, who showed her how to domesticate her husband, who trained her. It's a different world.
We became very friendly with the Arabs living next door. And in fact, the old lady next door was almost as much as my grandmother, as my real grandmother. I spent a lot of time there. I used to call her Auntie Maftin. Both my mother and my grandmother spoke Arabic, so they could converse freely with the Arabs. And the Arabs spoke Hebrew. As a matter of fact, today, there's no doubt that there are many more Arabs who speak a good Hebrew than there are Jews who even begin to understand Arabic.
There was no awareness of difference. There was a closeness, a great closeness between Muslims and Jews.
But this harmony was about to be torn apart by a controversial British policy. Jewish Zionists had been calling for the creation of a national homeland in Palestine. After years of campaigning, they persuaded the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour, to back their cause. In 1917, Balfour wrote a letter to one of the leaders of this movement.
His Majesty's government viewed with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The letter, which became known as the Balfour Declaration, would have profound implications for the future of Palestine.
In that seemingly simple statement, Balfour had made actually quite a huge commitment. He had now wedded British policy to create a Jewish entity in Palestine.
For the Muslims of Palestine, the Zionist campaign was a threat. These pictures show one of France's most senior clerics, Cardinal Dubois, arriving in Jerusalem on a diplomatic and religious mission. Cardinal Dubois was carrying a petition signed by Palestinian Muslims opposed to the Balfour Declaration. It read, "In the name of justice and of equality, we ask you not to allow Jewish immigration to Palestine and to remove from us the Zionist danger. We cannot permit this without sacrificing our precious blood." But Balfour ignored the protests of Palestine's Muslim population. Britain's commitment to a Zionist homeland ignited tensions between Jews and Muslims.
Balfour belonged to a group of Christian Zionists. He knew the kings of the Bible before he learned anything about British kings, so he felt very strongly about the Holy Land. He felt very strongly about the Jewish people. He felt very strongly about the need to return. And of course, he saw that he had the opportunity to be the one who returns the Jews to the Holy Land.
In 1925, Kahn's photographers followed Lord Balfour on his historic visit to Jerusalem. In the years since he'd made his famous declaration, almost 100,000 Jews had arrived in Palestine. Balfour laid foundation stones at the Hebrew University, an institution intended to turn Hebrew into a living language and give the new Jewish settlers a strong national identity.
We are now 7 years after the publication of the Balfour Declaration. Thousands of Jews already live in Palestine as a result of that declaration. The Zionist dream starts to realize itself. And here, the man himself comes to Jerusalem to attend the opening of the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. And this is an extraordinary event. These pictures are extraordinary because this was a very, very political event in the history of this country.
There were I would reckon about 20,000 people present there. And among them were my father and mother, who were invited, because my father was considered a prominent member of the Jewish community. I can see the great enthusiasm with which, especially Balfour, was greeted.
When the invited guests see him walking up Mount Scopus, to them he is the Messiah, he is the Redeemer. He is the man who is actually returning the Jewish people from exile to their own country for the first time in 2,000 years.
To rapturous crowds, Balfour outlined his vision of a new Jewish homeland.
This is a new experiment. It has never been tried before. Unless I have profoundly mistaken the genius of the Jewish people. The experiment is predestined to inevitable success, on which not only men of Jewish birth, but others sharing the common civilization of the world will have reason to congratulate themselves.
I would say he looked messianic. I can't think of any other word. He was wearing one of these university robes, and he had this hair that was all over the place, and he was using his hands a lot as he spoke. My parents told me, this is it. That's what we've been waiting for.
After laying the foundations at the Hebrew University, Balfour visited the new collective farms which were being set up by Jews across Palestine. These settlements were built on land bought from the Arabs.
Lord Balfour's visit to Palestine was something of a triumphal tour of the architect of the Jewish national home coming to see the first fruits of this pledge, this promise, this policy.
I think one of the most interesting pictures is where you see the Star of David, somewhat makeshift Star of David, and the British flag together, and that really symbolizes everything.
Many of the Jews cheering Balfour in Tel Aviv had arrived in Palestine after fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe and Russia.
You really have a sense of how large the Zionist population of Palestine was already in 1925, and the fact that there is no mistaking the immigrant nature of this community. These are very European-looking people, really a people apart from the Palestinians themselves.
Obviously, these are very one-sided pictures because they only show the Zionist joy. They don't show the reaction of the Arabs to Balfour's visit.
At the time, Jerusalem's Muslim shopkeepers battened their doors and locked their shutters in protest at Balfour's visit.
People were very upset. There was a general strike. They dressed in mourning. And of course, what Balfour did was a great betrayal. It was considered as a great betrayal to the Arabs.
we also see how inevitable the war between Israelis and Palestinians was. It's not the fault of the British. It was just inevitable. Opening Palestine to the Zionist dream meant war.
In 1948, the State of Israel was established. Almost a quarter of a century after his visit, Balfour's promise had become a political reality.
My generation has lost a lot. We have inherited the wars, the problems, the tensions, the hostilities that tear the Jewish people and the Arabs apart.
In the years after the Great War, the destiny of the Palestinians still hung in the balance, and the same uncertainties were faced by people